No one expected that a single cup of coffee would shake the United States Marine Corps, ignite national headlines, and rewrite one woman's destiny. But that is exactly what happened on a quiet Wednesday morning in Mason, Georgia, when Grace Donnelly chose conscience over compliance. She was not a politician, she was not an activist, she was simply a cafe manager who believed that dignity was worth more than policy. Yet, in that small act pouring a cup of coffee for a veteran and his service dog, she crossed an invisible line between following the rules and honoring what is right. The story began inside the Mason Mug Café. Grace stood behind the counter as she had done for 6 steady years. Her sleeves rolled, her hands already remembering every order before words were spoken. Veterans came here because it felt safe, not polished, not perfect, but human. That morning, she spotted Ray McMillan near the door, a late 50s ex-Marine. His gait steady but cautious, his eyes scanning the room before sitting. Beside him walked Shadow, a black Labrador Shepherd mix, wearing a red vest that read in bold white letters, "Service dog, do not pet." Grace smiled warmly, pointing to the window table, the one that caught the first sunlight of the day. "Table by the window's open, Ray," she said. "Coffee's already brewing." He nodded once, murmuring a thank you, and took his seat. For a moment, it was just another ordinary day, until the bell above the door rang again. The man who entered did not carry warmth, he carried authority. His navy blazer was pressed to perfection, his shoes polished to mirror shine. In his hand, a clipboard, the most dangerous weapon in any small business. "Logan Prescott, State Health Inspector," his tag read. Grace blinked, startled. No inspection was scheduled. "Good morning," she said politely. "Can I help you find something?" "Unannounced inspection," he replied, his tone mechanical. He moved with surgical precision, opening refrigerators, tapping on metal counters, noting temperatures, flipping lids. Everything about him said procedure. Everything about Grace said patience. Then he froze. His eyes landed on Shadow, the black dog sitting calmly beside Ray's chair. "That animal," Prescott barked, pointing sharply, "is in violation of state health code. No animals are permitted where food is served." Every conversation in the cafe died. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. Chairs went still. Grace stepped from behind the counter, her voice calm but firm. "Sir, he's a registered service dog. The Americans with Disabilities Act allows him to be here." Prescott frowned, flipping his clipboard. "I do not care what vest he wears. Animals shed hair, saliva, dander. This is a health hazard. Either the dog leaves, or I shut this cafe down today." Ray stiffened, his fingers tightening around his cup. Shadow stayed still, only his eyes lifting toward his owner, waiting for command, trained for calm. The room seemed to shrink. Grace took a slow breath, knowing what her next words would cost her. "I will not ask a veteran to leave," she said. "And I will not ask his service dog to leave either. You can write your report, but you will be doing it knowing you tried to humiliate a man who served this country." A hush swept the room. Somewhere in the back, someone whispered, "Damn right." But before the air could settle, another voice cut through, colder, sharper, final. "Grace Donnelly," it said. Standing in the doorway was Deborah Lyle, the regional manager of Mason Muggs Corporate. She had arrived for a routine check-in and had seen everything. "You have just violated a direct health compliance policy," Deborah declared, her tone ice. "Pack your things. You are terminated." Gasps rippled through the cafe. A spoon clattered to the floor. Ray half rose, his mouth open but silent. Grace did not move. Not at first. She simply looked around at Ray, at Shadow, at the chalkboard that read, "Heroes Hour today, free coffee for veterans." Then she smiled. Just barely. She untied her apron, her hands trembling, folded it neatly, and placed it on the counter. Turning to her young barista, Lena, she said softly, "Make sure Ray gets his refill." No tears. No anger. Just a woman walking out into the sunlight fire, not for breaking a rule, but for refusing to break her soul. And yet, what Grace could not know in that moment was that someone, a quiet teenager near the pastry case, had filmed the entire exchange on a phone. Within minutes, it was posted online. Within hours, it was being shared. And before the morning rush had even ended, something began to rumble across Mason, Georgia, something far larger than coffee, or policy, or pride. Because 4 military Humvees were already on their way. Grace Donnelly was not the kind of woman people noticed first, but she was always the one they remembered. At 35 years old, she managed the Mason Mug Café, a small brick-front shop tucked between a hardware store and a post office in downtown Mason, Georgia, just 15 minutes from Fort Granger, one of the largest Marine installations in the Southeast. The café wasn't fancy. No espresso martinis, no imported beans, just strong coffee and handwritten notes on the bulletin board that said things like, "You matter here." Mason was the kind of town that looked like a postcard from another era. Oak-lined sidewalks, American flags waving from porches, and the faint echo of wind chimes on summer afternoons. Outsiders called it peaceful. Locals called it predictable. But inside Grace's Café, life felt different, warmer, more awake. It wasn't a business to her. It was a refuge. She built it like a second home for anyone who needed to breathe again. Every morning she arrived before sunrise, unlocking the door with the same key her husband once carried. She'd light a candle near the counter, her quiet ritual, then brew the first pot while whispering a simple prayer for calm. Regulars noticed that she never hurried, never raised her voice, and somehow remembered everyone's name. There were veterans who couldn't sleep, young mothers from the base, retired teachers, even drifters passing through who ended up staying for hours. What made the Mason mug special wasn't the coffee, it was Grace. She knew who liked their eggs over hard, who couldn't handle crowds after Afghanistan, and who still flinched at sudden noises. She kept an unspoken promise. Inside her cafe, no one was judged, and no one was invisible. She once told a customer, "Sometimes all a person needs is 5 quiet minutes and a hot cup." And somehow, those 5 minutes became lifelines. Local papers occasionally mentioned her name, calling her the Heart of Mason. But Grace never sought praise. When the mayor tried to give her a plaque for community service, she laughed it off, saying, "Coffee's enough of an award." To her, kindness was not charity, it was duty. The kind that doesn't wear a uniform, but serves just the same. Behind that counter, Grace wasn't just serving drinks. She was holding together the unseen threads of a town that had forgotten how much people needed one another. And yet, even in all her calm, there was something unspoken, a quiet grief that lived beneath her smile, waiting to surface. Because one photograph on the wall would remind her every single day what love and loss really meant. Above the register, framed in soft wood, hung a single photograph, a man in jeans and a flannel shirt, holding a steaming mug of coffee in front of the cafe door. His smile was quiet, the kind that told 1,000 stories without a word. That man was Staff Sergeant Michael Donnelly, Grace's husband, killed in action 6 years earlier in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. The photo had been taken 2 weeks before his final deployment. He never came home. Every morning, Grace touched the corner of that frame before turning on the lights. It was not superstition. It was communion, a daily promise that his absence would not mean the end of purpose. The cafe became her answer to grief, her way of keeping him alive in the world. Not as a fallen soldier, but as a man who once loved people through simple gestures like laughter, patience, and coffee refills. She never wore black. She never held memorials. She just worked. Locals said she poured her grief into the cups. But it was deeper than that. She poured herself into others because she knew the feeling of being lost in plain sight. Soldiers who returned home silent found in Grace a mirror of that quiet endurance, the same kind that holds tears behind steady hands. Sometimes, during slow afternoons, she'd look at Michael's photo and whisper, "I'm still here." It wasn't about bravery. It was about continuing the mission, the invisible one that every spouse of a fallen Marine carries. Her loyalty didn't end with his life. It transformed into something larger. The cafe was her unit now. Her customers were her platoon. Every cup she served was an act of remembrance. Grace never remarried. When asked why, she'd simply smile and say, "I already met my forever." People respected her for that, not out of pity, but out of awe. Because in a world that moves too fast, she still believed in staying in, showing up every day for others, even when the world doesn't show up for you. And that belief gave birth to something that would soon become a lifeline for the entire town. Heroes Hour. Every Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock sharp, a small ritual unfolded at the Mason Mug Café. Grace called it Heroes Hour, though to her, it was never about titles, it was about time. It started quietly, with 3 regulars sitting around the same corner table near the window. Ben Donnelly, her father-in-law, and a retired Marine Corps drill instructor with a voice like gravel. Ralph, a Vietnam veteran who rarely spoke but never missed a single week. And Louisa, a former Army nurse whose laugh could cut through any gloom. The first time they gathered, there was no plan, no banner, just coffee and conversation. Ben had said, "We all need somewhere to sit that isn't a therapist's chair," and Grace nodded. From that moment, she made sure the table stayed open every Wednesday, no reservations, no rules. Just a standing invitation. If you've served, you belong. Over the months, the group grew. Veterans from Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan, men and women from every generation found their way through that door, drawn not by caffeine, but by connection. Grace always started the hour the same way. She'd pour the first round, then say softly, "This is a place to be seen, not fixed. To sit, not perform." The veterans would nod, shoulders easing as steam rose from their mugs. Some told jokes about boot camp days. Others stared quietly into their coffee, the silence saying everything words could not. Grace knew when to speak and when to simply listen. She never forced healing, she hosted it. Behind her smile was a precise empathy. She knew that battlefields do not end at borders. Trauma lingers in small sounds, the clang of a spoon, the sudden slam of a car door, so she kept the cafe gentle. No harsh lights, no loud music, just the steady hum of belonging. Local newspapers eventually covered it, calling Heroes Hour the soul of Mason. But to Grace, it was just Wednesday, the one morning each week, that reminded her why she opened the cafe at all. As the months passed, that corner table became a landmark. Soldiers returning from deployment stopped there before seeing their families. Widows brought photos. Young recruits came for advice they could not ask their officers. Every person left a little lighter. And though Grace never said it aloud, she sometimes looked around that table and thought, if Michael could see this, he would understand. Yet peace, even the quiet kind, rarely lasts forever. The next Wednesday would begin like all the others. Fresh coffee, familiar laughter, sunlight spilling through the glass, but by noon, the cafe's warmth would be replaced by shock, silence, and the sound of an accusation that would turn Mason, Georgia, upside down. It was a crisp Wednesday morning, the kind where sunlight looked cool but carried a hint of warmth, and steam curled from every cup like quiet ghosts. Grace was behind the counter, her rhythm unbroken, sleeves rolled, apron tied, hair pinned neatly, eyes scanning every face with that calm, familiar welcome. She had already brewed the first pot of dark roast for Heroes Hour, setting out the ceramic mugs she reserved for the veterans. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, wrapping the cafe like comfort itself. The bell above the door jingled softly. Ray McMillan stepped inside, his posture straight but his eyes tired, the kind of tired that lives deep, not from sleepless nights, but from memories that never rest. He was in his late 50s, a former Marine Corps recon, the kind of man who carried silence like a second language. Beside him padded Shadow, a black Labrador German Shepherd mix, trained, focused, alert to every sound yet calm, as if he understood exactly why they were there. Shadow's vest caught the light, bright red, bold white letters. "Service dog, do not pet." Grace smiled instantly. "Table by the windows open," she said gently, nodding toward his favorite corner. Ray gave a small nod back, murmured a quiet, "Thank you," and walked over with Shadow at his heel. The dog settled beneath the table, head on paws, eyes never leaving his handler. The cafe had seen many faces, but everyone knew Ray's presence carried a gravity all its own. Grace poured his coffee exactly the way he liked, strong, no sugar, and placed it on the table without asking. "Good to see you, Ray," she said softly. He looked up for a brief moment, offered a hint of a smile, then stared out the window. Sometimes that was all the conversation needed. Around them, laughter echoed, spoons clinked, and the day went on as if peace were permanent. Outside, the town of Mason carried on its quiet rituals, mail trucks, flag raising at the courthouse, children late for school. Inside, Grace moved through her cafe like a conductor, every gesture deliberate, every moment stitched together with care. No one could have guessed that in the next half hour, all that calm would fracture, because the next sound the cafe would hear wasn't laughter. It was the sharp whoosh of the front door, and the arrival of a man whose clipboard would bring a storm. The door swung open with a quick, deliberate whoosh, cutting through the warmth like a blade. Standing there was a man who seemed to despise comfort. His shoes shone with the reflection of the morning light, his navy blazer pressed with military precision, his face unreadable except for the kind of tightness that comes from taking pride in rules rather than people. A small silver name tag glinted on his chest. Logan Prescott, State Health Inspector. Grace blinked in surprise. There was no inspection scheduled. Still, she wiped her hands on her apron and approached with a polite smile. "Good morning," she said. "Can I help you find something?" "Unannounced inspection," Prescott replied, his tone clipped, almost rehearsed. He moved through the cafe like a surgeon dissecting a patient, pulling refrigerator doors, tapping on metal counters, checking thermometers, jotting notes without glancing up. The regulars went quiet. Veterans who had faced desert fire and jungle rain now watched in silence as the stranger's clipboard moved like a metronome of authority. Then he stopped. His eyes locked on Shadow, the black service dog lying under Ray's table. Prescott froze mid-step, disbelief etched into his features. "That animal," he said loudly, pointing, "is in violation of state health code. No animals are permitted where food is served." The air changed instantly. Laughter died. The spoon tapping against a cup froze mid-ring. Grace's smile faded, but her voice stayed steady. "Sir, that's a registered service dog," she said. "The Americans with Disabilities Act allows him to be here." Prescott's nostrils flared. "I do not care what vest he wears. Animals bring saliva, hair, bacteria. This is a public health hazard. Either the dog leaves or your establishment faces closure." Every veteran in the room stiffened, their silence heavy. Ray's jaw tensed, his hand trembling slightly as he gripped his cup. Shadow didn't move, only lifted his eyes toward Ray, waiting for calm, like the disciplined partner he had been trained to be. Grace stepped closer, folding her hands before her. Her tone was quiet, but every syllable carried steel. "He served this country," she said, glancing at Ray. "That dog keeps him alive. I will not ask him to leave." Prescott frowned, tapping his clipboard harder. "Are you refusing a direct order from a state health official?" Grace didn't flinch. "I'm refusing to humiliate a veteran in front of the people he fought to protect." For a moment, no one breathed. A veteran near the counter muttered under his breath, "Damn right." And then the door opened again. A woman in a dark suit stepped in, heels sharp, expression sharper. Deborah Lyle, the regional manager for Mason Muggs Corporate, had arrived early for her quarterly inspection, just in time to witness the standoff. Her eyes swept the room like a scanner, landing on Grace. "Grace Donnelly," she said, her voice clipped, cold, final. "You've just violated a direct health compliance policy in front of a state inspector. Pack your things. You're terminated." The room erupted in gasps. A spoon clattered to the tile. Someone whispered, "You can't be serious." Ray stood halfway, his face stunned. Grace didn't speak. She looked at Ray, at Shadow, at the chalkboard that read in white chalk, "Heroes Hour today, free coffee for veterans." Her eyes softened. She untied her apron, her hands trembling just once. Folding it carefully, she laid it on the counter and turned to Lena, the young barista who stood frozen by the espresso machine. "Make sure Ray gets his refill," Grace said gently. Then she walked to the side door, sunlight spilling across her face as she stepped out. No tears, no anger, just quiet grace in motion. Inside, no one spoke. The inspector's clipboard lowered. The manager's jaw tightened. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. But in the corner, a teenager lifted a phone, his thumb pressing record. That short clip would soon travel farther than anyone in that cafe could imagine, because before the end of that morning rush, the story of a woman who refused to bend for a rule would reach the screens of thousands. And one of those screens would belong to a United States Marine Corps colonel, a man who owed his life to a veteran just like Ray. And at that very moment, 4 military Humvees were already leaving Fort Granger's gates, engines humming, heading straight for the Mason Mug Café. For 35 long minutes, the Mason Mug Café stayed frozen in silence. The air felt heavy, thick with disbelief. Customers whispered softly, glancing toward the door Grace had just walked through, as if half expecting her to return. Some left their coffee untouched. Others sat still, staring at the chalkboard where her handwriting remained like a farewell. Lena, the young barista Grace had trained, stayed behind the counter. Her hands trembled as she refilled Ray's cup, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know what to say," she would later admit. "But if I walked away, I'd be letting her down." Ray sat motionless, staring at the rising steam. Shadow lay curled at his feet, ears twitching, sensing the weight in the room but staying still, trained to protect through silence. Then, faintly, a sound rolled through the distance. A low rumble, barely noticeable at first, like thunder moving beneath the ground. The coffee in Ray's cup rippled. Glasses rattled on the shelves. Lena froze mid-pour. The veterans looked up, every instinct alert, every breath caught. Through the morning mist at the far end of Main Street, 4 military Humvees emerged, their engines growling as they rolled past the courthouse and turned toward the cafe. Tires ground against pavement. Sunlight struck their windshields, flashing white like signals. The vehicles moved in formation, deliberate and slow, until they stopped directly in front of the Mason Mug. When the doors opened, uniformed Marines stepped out, disciplined, composed, every movement precise. And then came the figure who made the room fall completely still. Colonel Richard Gaines, United States Marine Corps, in full dress blues, gold buttons gleaming, white gloves in hand. His expression unreadable, his purpose unmistakable. Inside the cafe, the inspector froze. His clipboard hung useless by his side. The regional manager stepped back, color draining from her face. Lena whispered, "Oh my God." The bell above the door jingled once as Colonel Gaines stepped inside, boots striking the floor like a slow drum beat. He paused in the center of the cafe, scanning the room, taking in every stunned face. When his eyes found Ray, the Marine veteran stood slowly, back straight, chin lifted. The two men locked eyes, no words, no explanations, just recognition. Then, without hesitation, the colonel raised his hand in salute. The cafe went silent enough to hear the hum of the coffee machine. And that was when Logan Prescott, the health inspector, finally stammered, I didn't know who he was." The colonel turned, his voice calm but unshakable. "You don't need to know who someone is to treat them with basic dignity." Then he looked at Lena. "Is Grace Donnelly here?" She shook her head. "She was fired, sir, for standing up for him." The colonel's jaw tightened. His tone dropped to something that made the air vibrate. "That woman has served this community better than most agencies combined," he said. "She gave my men a place to breathe when they came home broken. And she treated a Marine with the respect this nation promised him and forgot." Ray finally spoke, voice low and rough. "She didn't ask questions," he said. "She just poured the coffee and gave me a place to sit. That was the first time in years I felt human again." The colonel nodded once. Then he turned to the Marines waiting outside and made a silent hand signal. They entered with precision. Two of them stepped behind the counter, removed the corporate logo from the wall, and folded it neatly like a flag. Another replaced the chalkboard with a new one they had brought along, freshly painted in bold white letters. "Welcome to Grace's house where honor is served daily." When Deborah Lyle, the regional manager, tried to speak, Colonel Gaines looked at her once. "You've made your decision," he said evenly. "Now we'll make ours." Then he walked toward the door, taking out his phone. A moment later, Lena's phone buzzed. She looked down, confused. "It's a message from Fort Granger," she whispered. "They're requesting Grace report to base headquarters today." Ray exhaled slowly, disbelief flickering in his eyes. Shadow stood up, tail flicking once, ready. Something had shifted in the air, the kind of shift that happens right before history begins to move. Grace sat in her old pickup truck at the edge of her driveway, keys in hand but engine off. She had been sitting there for 15 minutes, motionless, coffee-stained jeans and her favorite blue flannel still smelling faintly of roasted beans. Her phone screen glowed with one unread message. "Report to Fort Granger headquarters. Colonel Richard Gaines requests your presence." Her heart beat in a rhythm she didn't recognize, not fear, not relief, something in between. For years, that road had been her daily route from home to the cafe, from sunrise to closing. But this morning, it led somewhere entirely new. She didn't know what the colonel wanted. She only knew that everything in her life had suddenly been seen. The video, the cafe, the moment she thought was her ending, all of it had become something larger than she could control. She finally turned the ignition. The truck groaned awake. As she drove toward Fort Granger, the town passed in familiar blurs, the courthouse, the diner, the faded billboard with the flag that hadn't been repainted since the Reagan years. People waved as she passed, their faces a mixture of curiosity and quiet pride. Grace realized the story had already spread. Mason wasn't gossiping. Mason was watching. At the gate, 2 Marines saluted her in. The base looked like its own small city, perfectly aligned roads, trimmed lawns, the sound of cadence calls echoing through the November air. Grace had been there before as a Marine's wife, but this time she felt like an outsider walking into sacred ground. The memory of Michael tugged at her chest as she followed the directions toward the administration building. Inside, she found Colonel Gaines waiting. Gone were the formal blues. Now he wore khaki fatigues, his posture relaxed but still commanding. "Grace Donnelly," he said, offering his hand. "Thank you for coming." She shook it firmly, unsure if she should speak first. "I wasn't sure why you wanted to see me," she admitted. He smiled slightly. "Then let me show you." He led her down a hallway lined with plaques, photos, and unit mottos painted in gold. They stopped in front of a simple door labeled Veteran Transition and Wellness Initiative. Inside, the room was nearly empty folding chairs, a few whiteboards, half-unpacked boxes of donated supplies. "We've been trying to build this center for 2 years," the colonel said. We've got the funding, but not the right leadership. Grace crossed her arms. I'm not a therapist, she said softly. I don't have degrees or credentials. The colonel shook his head. No, but you built something better, a place where veterans found peace without realizing they were healing. His voice softened. You did more with coffee and kindness than some programs do with $1 million budget. Before she could respond, a voice came from the back room. Is that her? A young woman stepped out mid-20s, her long sleeves covering burn scars along her arms and jaw. A golden retriever puppy walked beside her, wearing a red vest marked in training. Hi, she said shyly. I saw the video. I haven't been inside a cafe since I came home, but I think I could in yours. Grace's throat tightened. She knelt slightly, resting her hand near the pup's back. He's beautiful, she whispered. The young woman smiled for the first time. The colonel glanced at Grace. We'd like to offer you the position as director of this center, he said. Not as a figurehead, but as its heart. Grace blinked, stunned. You're serious? The colonel grinned faintly, as serious as a heart attack. Grace looked around the empty room, imagining chairs filled with stories, silence turning into belonging, fear turning into laughter. She thought of Ray, of Shadow, of every veteran who had ever walked into her cafe looking for peace. Then she nodded once. I'll do it. The colonel extended his hand again, firm, certain. Then let's get to work. Outside, as Grace left the building, the wind carried the faint sound of Marines calling cadence in the distance. For the first time in years, she felt purpose without pain. What she didn't yet know was that this small room, bare, unfinished, waiting would soon become the heartbeat of something that reached far beyond Mason, Georgia. Within weeks, the Veteran Transition and Wellness Center began to change from an empty shell into something alive. Grace arrived before dawn every morning, opening blinds to let in sunlight, arranging chairs into small circles instead of rows. She brewed coffee the same way she had at the cafe, strong, honest, no pretense. A place to be seen, not fixed, she wrote on a whiteboard. Just like before, the first veterans came hesitantly. Some stayed near the door. Some brought their service dogs, tails low, eyes wary. Grace never asked questions. She just handed them mugs and waited for them to speak or not. Slowly, word spread through Fort Granger that something rare was happening in that small room. People were healing without being told to. Ray McMillan came back first, his step steadier now. Shadow walked straight to the same corner he had always chosen, lying down with quiet ownership. Then came Tiffany Rios, the young burn survivor. She did not talk much, but started sketching again, filling pages with drawings of dogs, hands, and homecomings. Even Lena, the young barista from Mason Mug, visited every Friday, bringing pastries and laughter that made the space feel familiar again. Grace didn't run programs. She built trust. A whiteboard by the coffee pot read, "Who needs a ride? Who needs a listener?" Underneath, people wrote names, numbers, and small notes, like "Wife left," "Need a job," "Just need company." Grace didn't erase them. She connected the dots quietly, one phone call, one conversation at a time. Not everyone believed in her methods. A few officials visited, clipboards in hand, asking for paperwork, metrics, results. They questioned her qualifications, her lack of formal training. "What certification do you have to counsel veterans?" one asked. Grace met his stare. "None," she said. "Just consistency and kindness." The man hesitated, then looked away. Weeks turned into months. The center grew into something sacred not through policy, but presence. Some days were loud with laughter. Others were silent except for the sound of coffee pouring and pens scratching. Grace kept a small notebook behind her desk, the same one from the Mason Mug, where she wrote every veteran's name and the one thing they most missed about home. Late one evening, Colonel Gaines stopped by, watching her from the doorway. "You've done it again," he said quietly. "You've built a home out of nothing." Grace smiled faintly, closing her notebook. "No, sir. They did. I just kept the door open." The colonel nodded, knowing she meant every word. Outside, the American flag fluttered against a fading orange sky, and the sound of laughter drifted from the hall. But behind that peace, something new was brewing, the kind of attention that brings both recognition and risk. Because within days, Grace's little center would no longer be just a pilot program. It was about to become a model for the entire nation. It started with an email from Washington. The Veteran Transition and Wellness Center was being reviewed for possible expansion into a national model. Grace read the message twice, unsure whether to smile or panic. To her, this was not a movement, it was just a room with coffee, honesty, and people who finally felt human again. But to the Department of Defense, it had become something revolutionary. Auditors arrived quietly, wearing suits instead of uniforms. They inspected logs, counted attendance sheets, even checked the water filters on the coffee machine. Grace answered their questions with patience, sometimes with humor. When one asked how she measured success, she said, "When someone walks in broken and leaves laughing." The inspector stared, then wrote something she never saw. A week later, Colonel Gaines showed up holding an envelope. "You might want to sit down," he said. Inside was an official letter with the Department of Defense seal. Grace unfolded it slowly, her heart hammering. "You are hereby nominated for the National Civilian Commendation for Distinguished Service to Veterans." She blinked, reading it again, almost refusing to believe it. "I didn't do anything special," she whispered. The colonel smiled. "That's exactly why you're getting it." Along with the letter came an invitation to attend and speak at the National Veterans Advocacy Conference in Washington, District of Columbia. Grace felt her knees weaken. "I'm not a public speaker." The colonel laughed softly. "You are now." The morning she left for Washington, Grace packed light. One navy blue blazer, Michael's old wristwatch, and her small notebook filled with names and notes from the café. As she waited at the airport gate, she heard a familiar voice. "Need a ride, Miss Donnelly?" She turned and saw Ray McMillan, dressed in full marine blues, Shadow calm by his side. "The base assigned me as your escort," he said with a proud grin. Grace laughed, shaking her head. "You clean up pretty well, Ray." He chuckled. "You're the one about to speak to the Pentagon." Together they boarded the plane, the Marine and the cafe manager, two souls linked by one simple act of kindness that had reshaped both their lives. When the plane took off, Grace looked out the window, the clouds spreading like fields of white beneath her. She thought about Mason, about Hero's Hour, about the faces she'd seen across the counter. She whispered softly to herself, this was never about coffee. She didn't yet know that the moment she stepped onto that stage in Washington, her story would reach every corner of the nation. The ballroom in Washington was larger than any space Grace had ever stood in. White tablecloths, polished brass podiums, and cameras waiting in silence made the air feel heavy with expectation. Her name glowed on the giant screen behind her, Grace Donnelly, Director, Veteran Transition and Wellness Center. She took the stage slowly, her steps echoing in the quiet. "I'm not a general," she began, her voice soft but steady. "I'm not a doctor. I ran a cafe near a military base. I poured coffee. I listened." The room leaned in. But in that space, I watched something sacred happen. Veterans came not for advice, but for presence. They didn't need to be fixed, they needed to be seen. A ripple of emotion spread through the crowd, some nodding, others wiping their eyes. "One day," she continued, "I was fired for letting a veteran sit with his service dog. That was the day everything changed. But the truth is, it was never about coffee or rules. It was about dignity." When she said the last word, the room erupted in applause, long, thunderous, raw. Ray stood in the back, straight as a statue, his silver star pinned to his chest. He didn't clap. He just nodded. A Marine's salute in silence. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed, a man in a gray suit approached her. He was older, with a white beard and kind eyes behind thin glasses. "You don't remember me, do you?" he asked. Grace studied his face, uncertain. The man pulled an old, faded photograph from his pocket, a picture of Michael Donnelly, smiling outside the cafe years ago, standing beside that same man in uniform. "You poured me a cup of coffee the day I got my medical discharge," he said softly. "You didn't say anything, you just smiled. It was the first time I felt like myself again." He held out the photo. "It's yours now." Grace took it with trembling hands, speechless, tears finally slipping free. That photograph, forgotten, dusty, carried through years, had found its way back home. Outside, the evening sky over Washington glowed orange and gold. Grace stood on the steps, photo in hand, the sound of applause still echoing faintly behind her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like someone who had lost everything. She felt like someone who had finally delivered something back to the world. But her journey wasn't ending here because Mason was waiting, and so was something even deeper than recognition. When Grace returned to Mason, the town felt different. Flags waved brighter, windows glowed warmer, and for once, people didn't just see her as the woman from the cafe, they saw her as the reason the town still believed in kindness. But instead of going to the celebration at City Hall, she drove straight to the Veteran Transition and Wellness Center. The parking lot was half full, firelight flickering through the windows. Inside, A few veterans lingered by the hearth, mugs in hand, laughter rolling gently across the room. Grace walked to the wall of photos, faces of men and women who had found healing here. Slowly, she reached into her bag and added 2 pictures. One of the audience in Washington rising to their feet, and one of the old café taken the morning after the Humvees came. People shoulder to shoulder, dogs resting by tables. No fear, only connection. Beneath those photos, she taped a small white card with her handwriting. Honor grows where kindness is consistent. She stood still, reading the words twice. The space felt silent, alive, sacred, like Michael was standing there beside her again, coffee cup in hand, proud but quiet. For a moment, all the noise of the world disappeared. The door opened behind her. A young man stepped in, uniform sleeves rolled, eyes cautious but hopeful. "Is this the place for people like us?" he asked. Grace turned, smiling softly. "No, son," she said. "This is the place for people like all of us." The boy nodded once, stepping inside. The circle had opened again. Outside, the streetlights of Mason glowed against the night, casting reflections on the cafe window across the road. Inside, Grace poured another cup, slow and steady, the way she always did. In a world that keeps moving faster every day, her calm remained the same, the quiet rhythm of someone who still believed that small acts could move mountains. And as the lights dimmed, the narrator's voice lingered softly in the air. Grace Donnelly never wore a uniform, but she defended something's sacred dignity, and in doing so, she reminded us that honor isn't earned once, it's protected daily. The music swelled, warm and reflective, carrying the story back to where it began, a cup of coffee, a simple act, a woman who refused to look away. In the weeks that followed, Grace's story spread far beyond Mason. News stations replayed the viral video. Newspapers called her the woman who redefined service. And veterans groups across the country began creating Grace's Corners, small spaces in cafes, libraries, and community halls where no one sat alone. She didn't chase the spotlight, but the light found her anyway. And through it all, she stayed exactly the same, calm, grounded, unshaken. The Mason Mug Cafe reopened under a new name, Grace's House. Lena ran it now, with Ray and Tiffany helping on weekends. Photos of veterans lined the walls, and above the register hung a single quote in neat white letters. "A nation is only as strong as the kindness it keeps." People drove from other towns just to see where the story began, and many stayed longer than they planned because the air still felt like home. Every Wednesday at 9 o'clock, Heroes Hour continued. Ben, Ralph, Louisa, and new faces gathered around the same table. Laughter returned. Coffee poured. Sometimes, Grace would stop by quietly, sit at the back, and listen. She never announced herself, but the veterans always knew when she was there. The air seemed to soften, the noise dimmed, and the room felt complete again. Years later, when Grace's Wellness Center was officially declared a national model, she declined a ceremony in her honor. Instead, she asked for a small plaque to be placed on the cafe wall. It read simply, "For those who stand quietly for what's right." That was all she ever wanted, not recognition, but remembrance. And now, as her story comes full circle, the narrator's voice fades with a question that lingers long after the screen goes dark. How many graces have we passed without noticing? How many quiet acts of courage go unseen every day? Maybe the real legacy she left us isn't just a cafe or a center, but a challenge to listen more, to judge less, and to protect the dignity that defines us all. Because sometimes, the greatest revolutions begin not with a speech, but with a simple cup of coffee, and the courage to say, "No, this is what's right."